Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 344 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Sean Carroll. He's a research professor of physics at Caltech, specializing in quantum mechanics, gravitation, cosmology, statistical mechanics, and the foundations of physics. And he's also the author of several popular science books, including From Eternity to Here, The Particle at the End of the Universe, and The Big Picture. He's also served as a science consultant on movies and TV shows such as Thor, Bones, and Tron Legacy. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new podcast, Mindscape. And now here's our interview with Sean Carroll. All right, so we're here with Sean Carroll. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, and so you recently launched a new podcast called Mindscape. So why'd you decide to get involved in podcasting?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because it wasn't at all clear. I'd been on plenty of podcasts before, so I thought about it, and I'm always, the second wave of adopters of new social media technologies, whether it's blogging or Twitter or anything. I'm not at the cutting edge, at the bleeding edge of progress, but I resisted podcasting a long time because it seemed like it was more work, right? It requires more investment than just getting on Twitter or something like that. And also, I didn't think that I either had enough to say all by myself, nor really have an interest in being journalistic and talking to other people, sort of being the interviewer. But I realized that rather than interviewing people about, their life story and some funny anecdotes, I really enjoyed talking to people about the ideas that they were thinking about. And so I sort of hit upon a format that would fit for what I wanted to do, and couple of friends nudged me into it, and I said, yeah, let's give it a try.
Now, you interview some very highly intellectual guests. What percentage of those are people that you already knew, and what percentage are you just reaching out to cold?
I think it's a mixture. Early on, definitely people who I knew were helpful. I think these days it's about 50-50, people who I've, met in person and or knew some way or the other. But I also try to take advantage of, traveling to conferences and things like that. People who I had some reason to talk to, like I talked to Paul Bloom, psychologist, on Twitter about something. And so at the end of it, we said, look, this is not good enough for Twitter. Let's have a podcast.
I thought it was funny in one of your recent episodes, you said that there's this hardcore group that wants you to only talk about physics all the time.
Absolutely, yes. And, I totally get it. I mean, physics is what I know the best. So physics is where I have something special to offer. But most of my motivation for taking time out of my day to do the podcast is that it gives me a license to talk about other things as well. So I get to talk to people who are experts, and I get to play the person who doesn't know anything but is trying to learn something. I think that even though I'm a physicist, I'm also a professor. I'm an academic, and I've, been around academics my whole life. So this is a good way of me to get to learn from people who are the experts in fields that are utterly different than what I do for a living.
So what was the episode that was most outside your wheelhouse that you've done so far?
It was probably talking to Wynton Marsalis, the famous jazz trumpet player. I have a couple coming up that are even further away than that. But, like I said, I was at a conference, and Wynton Marsalis was there. And it turns out he's a huge fan of science. He loves it. He loves the cosmology. He was, there's a conference that was one of these ideas festival kind of things where there's talks on all sorts of different topics. But we met at, the reception or whatever and hit it off. And I said, I have this podcast recording equipment with me. Would you love to sit down? And it's very funny because he's a jazz musician, right? He's not a professor, so he's much more easygoing about, yeah, let's do that, but like not actually set up a time or a place or anything like that. But he did, to his enormous credit, make sure that we did get it done before all was said and done.
Right, because you actually record a lot of these face to face, right? Or some number are over the phone.
I definitely prefer doing face to face, in part because you get a little bit more of the actual conversation is better because you're seeing the person right across from you, in large part because the audio is better because not everyone is a podcaster themselves. But I'm happy to do remote interviews. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly I can't expect people to lug themselves over to my place or expect myself to be at their place.
I heard Terry Gross one time say something I thought was really interesting, where she does all her interviews over the phone. And she said that she prefers that because then the experience that she's having is the same experience that the audience is going to have. She's not getting any body language or facial cues or whatever that the audience is cut out from.
I think that's fair. I think that Terry Gross has a really super famous radio show, so she can ask her guests to come into the local NPR studio and sit at an ISDN line. And, these audio quality issues have been drilled into me as very important, so I do care about them. And she doesn't have to sacrifice. She's not talking to someone, driving down the street on their iPhone, while they're doing the interviews. But the other thing is, even though I get the argument that she's getting the same experience that they are, I've certainly had it be the case that when I'm talking to someone, we're chit-chatting about one thing and I'm like ready to wrap up and they're not. So like they make hand gestures to me like, no, we have to talk about this other thing. And that's very useful. And the audience never knows.
Yeah. I mean, you said that you started out being a guest on podcasts. What was that like? How did you get into that?
I think that I just have a presence on the internet and through being on TV shows and YouTube videos and things like that. So people hear about me. I write books, I have my own Twitter account, and et cetera. So I get a lot of invitations, and I wish I could say yes to all of them. I really can't. As a podcaster myself, when someone says no, which definitely happens, I'm like, really? It's just an hour out of your day. But as someone who gets asked to do podcasts, I'm like, well, I get a lot of invitations. I have to pick and choose. So I have to be thoughtful to the people whose time I'm using. And to be honest, even though people have said no, I've been very, very happy with the people who've said yes. I've had amazing response, and the people who have appeared on the show have been very giving both of their time and of, really deep, useful conversations that are accessible to a wide audience.
How many times have you been a guest on other podcasts?
Oh, gee, I don't know, but certainly dozens. It's interesting. At some point, I suppose I will pass. I've done more podcasts as an interviewer than as an interviewee, but I don't think we're there anywhere close yet.
Has it ever been a very memorable experience? Does anything stick out in your mind from being interviewed on podcasts?
I guess the two things that stick out, they're the bigger podcasts, right? So I was on Joe Rogan's show, and I was on Sam Harris's podcast, and that's always fun. It's a big audience, and you get a response. But the sort of funnest one I did was The Rights to Ricky Sanchez, which is a podcast about the Philadelphia 76ers. And I grew up in Philadelphia and I'm a huge basketball fan, so I'm a huge Sixers fan. And these guys just have a wacky podcast where largely they talk about the Sixers, but they'll talk about anything. And it's a lot of jokes and it's very fun. So I'm a devoted listener. And honestly, it's the podcast I listen to most often. And in the middle of the summer, when there's no NBA games, they will sometimes, cast a broad net for guests. So I volunteered myself and they said yes, since we had a great conversation.
So what sort of, when you said when you go on the really big podcasts like Joe Rogan and Sam Harris, you said that people respond. What sort of ways do they respond in?
Well, it's a very funny thing I've had to get used to, because between blogging and Twitter, you're used to responses to things you say coming within minutes, right? Especially on Twitter. Like the first half hour is the vast majority of responses you're going to get to a tweet. Whereas with a podcast, someone has to listen to it and then respond. So, it takes days or at the very least hours before you get much response. And my podcast is still fairly new, and the ways that people can respond and leave comments and so forth are a bit scattered, right? Like they can leave comments on my website or on the YouTube videos, or there's a Reddit subreddit to talk about these things. But when you're at a monster podcast, like Joe Rogan gets 1 million listeners to every episode, then there's just a lot of response right away, all over the place. And it's a very different audience. Like it's not my audience, right? So there's some overlap with my audience, but it's a different set of people. And it's always just fascinating to see how people who you're not used to interacting with respond to the things that you have to say.
I mean, my impression is that sort of the default mode of discourse on the internet is paranoid, hysterical accusations. Is that true even for when you're talking about physics?
Sure. There's a lot of crap on the internet. That's absolutely true. But I kind of get a little impatient with that characterization, because even though it's 100% accurate, it's not 100% accurate. It's 90% accurate, right? And I think that the 10% really matters here. I'm absolutely brutal about blocking people on Twitter and, banning people on YouTube comments on my posts, because there's a lot of people who are either, actively looking to cause trouble or just unpleasant in one way or the other. And I see no reason to invite those people into my house to talk to me, right? Like it's a invitation to a conversation, and I want to talk to people who I get something from, or at least don't actively dislike talking to. So I don't have time to, sit and negotiate with people about what is proper and improper etiquette, because for the most part, the people who want to be jerks are just going to be jerks. They're not going to go, oh, I didn't realize that I'm not supposed to be a jerk. So once you prune down the worst actors, you can actually get pretty decent conversations. I was extremely flattered to see that someone set up a subreddit to talk about me and my books and works and things like that. And the podcast is given new content there. And that's a really good group of people. It's a small little group, but they talk about the podcast and things like that. I've even, managed to get pretty good comments on YouTube, which I think is one of my greatest accomplishments in life.
I heard you say recently that your audience increased tenfold after you appeared on Joe Rogan. So does that mean that at least 90% of your listeners are sort of crossover Joe Rogan fans?
Yeah, I think it's very plausible that is true. And, still my audience is way smaller than Joe Rogan fans. Yeah. So it's not as if the demographics of my listeners are the same, because it's a highly selected subset. But, it's always a very interesting question where the audience comes from, and how they get there and how they stay. And, new people come in and old ones go away. And look, listening to a podcast is a bit of an investment, right? An hour and a half of your time. If you have a nice long workout or walk or drive to work, then it's perfect. But I totally get it when people say they just don't have time, because there's so many good podcasts out there. That's why, it's a little goad to me to make sure that I'm not just phoning it in. I try to get really interesting guests and have really useful, productive conversations.
Did you always know that you wanted to do a 60 to 90-minute podcast, or did that idea develop at some point?
No, it's not at all obvious, right? And I still don't think it's at all obvious. And, you get different advice, from very different places. I did go on the internet and Google, how to do a good podcast and so forth. And there's very different approaches. And I'm always a big pluralist about these things. I think it's good that there are different approaches. I think that it's good that, sometimes there's podcasts with just one person talking. Dan Carlin's, Hardcore History is one of my favorite podcasts. I think it's great when there's podcasts of like a bunch of people talking who have really good chemistry together. And so there's just many different ways to do it. I thought that, the length between an hour and a half seemed to be a sweet spot for me in terms of enough time to get into something without demanding a huge investment on the part of the person being interviewed. I try to be very respectful. I'm going after people who are really, really busy. Right. And so, again, Joe Rogan can do it because he has, a million listeners and people want to sell books or whatever. And when you go on to his show, like, number one, you go to his studio, and number two, you talk for 2.5 or 3 hours. I don't have the clout to do that right now. And also, the kind of people who I'm looking for, they're just not available to do that sometimes. So I want to get deep, but I don't want to be a burden on my guests. So I thought that was a good compromise.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, the length of a podcast can be driven by just the format. On this podcast, I almost always read a book, and then it's a weekly show. So I want, if I'm going to read an entire book, I want to talk about it for more than 20 minutes. And then if it's coming out once a week, I want people to get some substantial, I don't want people to wait a week and only have a 20-minute thing come out,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Once a week is about right for me. That's what I've been trying to do. And, it's interesting. I thought that it would be a certain amount of work. I was worried it'd be too much work, but actually getting the podcast done on a week-to-week basis has been less work than I worried it would be. And so I was very ready to say, like, look, guys, I'm going to do this once a month or once every couple of weeks. But so far, the weekly schedule has been pretty good, and that gives me a bit more flexibility. I can take a few more risks because, if you don't like it this week, there'll be a new guest next week.
Yeah. Well, so like I said, this is a podcast for science fiction fans, and so I was just curious to ask you, are you a science fiction fan? Kind of what is your background as a science fiction fan?
I am a science fiction fan. I'll shout out to Annalee Newitz, who is my one science fiction author who I've had as a guest on my podcast, and there might be more upcoming. By the way, I do have this thing where I don't announce who the guest is going to be until the episode is published, which I'm also not sure is a good idea or not. Like, I know a lot of people do that, but I kind of like it that, on Monday morning, it's a surprise in your mailbox when the guest is announced. But I was a kid reading science fiction books. Robert Heinlein was my favorite, but I read Isaac Asimov and Theodore Sturgeon, Roger Zelazny, Anne Caffrey, Ursula Le Guin, a little bit of people like Stanislaw Lem and people like that. So yeah, I was in science fiction right early on, and I sort of abandoned it for a while because life is short and there's only so many things you can do. And I had read a lot of science fiction. I wanted to sort of read other things for a while, but now I've kind of come back to it a little bit. I think that science fiction has changed, for the better. I think there's really good stuff coming out. I recently read N.K. Jemisin's trilogy, which was wonderful, and I'm a huge fan of Ian Banks. It was very sad that he passed away recently. So yeah, I love it, and it's definitely one of the things in my menu of things that I consume as a reader.
Now, a lot of people I talk to say that an interest in science fiction is what kind of drove them into science. Is that the case for you?
I don't think so. I think that they developed more or less simultaneously, but it's always hard to remember. Like when I was 10 years old and the stuff was going on, I wasn't keeping track of why I was following one thing or another. I read books, but they were nonfiction books in terms of what got me into science. I just read science books, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important to write popular level science books, because who knows who will be inspired by this kind of thing. I read books about the Big Bang and black holes, and I was never that uptight about whether the science fiction I was reading was scientifically accurate or not. And this goes through even to today when I act as a consultant on movies or TV shows. Getting the spirit of science right and getting the world that you're trying to build to be logically consistent in whatever it is much more important to me than sticking to the rules of the laws of physics as we know them in our world.
I just think it's interesting that you mentioned Roger Zelazny, who's my favorite author, particularly his Amber series, which involves very heavily or revolves around parallel worlds. Yeah. And you now are a proponent of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So I was curious if there's any connection there.
Like I said, not that I know of. And of course, the Amber series, for most, I'm tempted to say every single science fictional version of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics has been not scientifically accurate. But I think that's completely okay. I think that the best use of real out there speculative science in the realm of science fiction is as inspiration, not as guidance, right? I once had the wonderful experience of serving on a film jury at the Sloan Prize at the Sundance Film Festival. So the Sundance Film Festival, this big festival for independent movies that a lot of deals get done at. It's a big Hollywood thing. But there's a little prize sponsored by the Sloan Foundation for the movie with the best science content, broadly construed. And so I was on the jury to pick that. And one of the contenders, which eventually won, was a movie called Another Earth. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I saw the trailer. I haven't seen the movie.
Yeah, so I would say it's a pretty good movie. I could criticize it, but it's it was a low budget, thoughtful, well thought out movie. And it was the conceit was that there was a copy of Earth on the other side of the sun. Right. But it wasn't just another planet. It was an exact copy with same people on, different versions of ourselves living on the other planet. And something happens to bring our Earth and that Earth closer into contact. And we realize that each other exists and it goes from there. But so that's completely, utterly implausible in terms of science. But you could see that, maybe it was inspired by talk of parallel worlds, the multiverse, something like that. And because we awarded them the prize, we got to chat with the filmmakers afterward, and we realized that, yes, that is exactly what happened. The director had been listening to Brian Greene on PBS, and he started thinking about this alternate reality thing, and that gave him the idea for the movie. So I think that's a wonderful kind of interaction.
So how did you get involved in being a science consultant for Hollywood?
I mean, two main things are be a scientist and live in Los Angeles. That's those are the most important things. I did serve as a science consultant on Angels and Demons, the movie by Ron Howard in the Dan Brown trilogy kind of series. But then it really got going a lot more often with the founding of what's called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So the Exchange is a program from the National Academy of Sciences that exists to team up people in Hollywood with scientists who know what they're talking about. So it's basically a service for writers and directors and producers in Hollywood who need some scientific input. And my wife, Jennifer Willett, was the first director of the Science Entertainment Exchange. So for the first few years of its existence, I was the emergency backup scientist. I did some consulting, just because I was the right person, and some also just because someone else backed out or, couldn't be found. So that was a wonderful experience. I got to, interact with a lot of incredibly creative, intelligent people in the movie industry. One of the podcasts I did was with Scott Derrickson, the director of Doctor Strange and Sinister and other movies. And I met him in part through that kind of relationship.
I think it was in your conversation with Annalie, but you said that most science consultants for Hollywood could be replaced with a chatbot that said, make it a wormhole.
Well, there's certain themes that come up over and over again. That's absolutely true. So you want to travel faster than light, right? That's one of them, warp drive or wormholes. And the other one is you want to travel through time. That's just the thing that everyone wants to do. And I almost begin to feel bad because, I have a certain number of ideas about how time travel should work. And that number of ideas is smaller than the number of requests I have to consult on a time travel film. So I need to start making things up or something like that. But there's certain kind of obvious things, but they're obvious to me. They're not necessarily obvious to the person making the movie. And one of the things that, I hang out with a lot of professional scientists and they complain about movies and they're constantly saying things like, why don't they just call up some graduate student and get the basic facts right? But, the person making a movie doesn't know there's such a thing as a graduate student in physics who would be able to answer this. And even if they did, they wouldn't know where to find them. That's where the exchange becomes very, very helpful. So I think that, there's certain basics that are true everywhere. But the real hard work is in finding interesting narrative applications for those cool scientific ideas.
I thought it was striking that, wormholes play such a large role in especially Hollywood science fiction. But then in your interview with Kip Thorne, he gives a very low probability to wormholes actually being something that might exist and would be traversable.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but many things that appear in science fiction movies and novels have a very low probability of being real. Wormholes, teleportation, time travel, there's a long list. Warp drive. So wormholes, just exactly like warp drive, I would say, are things where we can imagine what they would be like. In other words, we can imagine scenarios in which they don't violate the laws of physics, but we're far from confident that they can exist. We don't know enough about the laws of physics to be sure, but the smart money is that no, there just aren't any wormholes, not any of the kind that you would actually use to travel around the galaxy.
So would you like to see more science fiction movies that don't have faster than light travel, teleportation, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I get it. Even the most wild science fiction is based on real human experience, right? Like Star Wars is basically a Western, they're modeled on the real world that we know and love. And you can easily imagine a world where there's interstellar travel that is slower than light. So, okay. Takes a few hundred years to get from star system to other star system, which is perfectly fine if you can put someone in cryogenic slumber or just extend human lifespans for a very long time. But it doesn't make for a good movie to wait 100 years to get from one star to another.
Right, because they're probably not really mad at the other person anymore by the time they get to
they exactly. So I think that it's not anything special about science, right? You can say the same thing about medicine, about law, about being a detective. These are all things where there's very regular ways in which TV and movies stretch the reality for dramatic purposes, and I think you just have to accept that.
Have you been watching The Expanse at all? Because that takes a much less fantastical approach to outer space science fiction.
Yeah, I did watch The Expanse a little bit. I really liked it. I just, for various reasons, sort of hopped off the wagon. But yeah, I think it's, let me be clear. It's perfectly possible to make fascinating and gripping science fiction that does try to obey the laws of physics and be real, because guess what? Reality itself is very exciting and gripping sometimes, so therefore it must be possible. And even once we are able to go to, the moon and Mars and the outer planets, it'll still be interesting. There'll still be interesting stories being told. So, I think it's there's a lot of room for sticking close to reality. Movies like The Martian or Europa Report do a very good job of showing exactly that.
Yeah. I interviewed the showrunner for The Expanse, Naren Shankar, and he actually has a PhD in physics, and I think that really makes a difference. Yeah.
Well, I think that's right. A lot of what I've experienced in being a consultant for Hollywood is, it's not that they want to violate the laws of physics, it's that they don't know what the laws of physics are, and, they're more familiar with other science fiction movies than with science books. So, they just sort of naturally turn to certain things that they know how to do. And the best possible thing that a science consultant can do is, rather than saying, no, you can't do that, is to say, well, here are 3 other ways you could do that might be more realistic, scientifically speaking.
Right. You mentioned Ian Banks's culture novels. I don't know, Amazon is apparently developing that for a TV series right now. I don't know if you've followed that at all.
I sort of vaguely heard that, but yeah, I'm just like you always are when a beloved series gets a adaptation on the horizon. You're like, well, I hope it's good. I mean, if it's good, it's great. If it's not good, it'll ruin my childhood.
Yeah, and I don't know if they have what the science consultant situation is with that show, but hopefully they've got some science consulting going on.
Yeah, and guess what? The culture novels are not completely scientifically accurate for various reasons. So that's completely okay, but there's a lot of mind-stretchy ideas in there that I think would lend themselves to, wonderful adaptations if they do it right.
Yeah, I mean, Player of Games and Use of Weapons are just 2 of my all-time favorite novels.
Yeah, I just love them all. I can reread them. I'm blessed with the ability to forget the plots and characters in books that I've read. So I have a great pleasure in rereading novels that I know that I like because I liked them last time.
I heard you say that you consulted with Ridley Scott on Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, which, never got made, but what was that process like? Yeah,
I think people have a slightly inaccurate view of what the glamorous world of science consulting in Hollywood is like. For one thing, you don't get paid for it. You just go in for a couple hours in the afternoon and you talk to the screenwriter or director or the producer, whoever asked for your help, and you chat for a couple hours and you do your best to give them advice, and then you never hear from them again. So that's the usual paradigm. And so, I consulted on the upcoming Avengers Endgame movie, and I gave him great stuff, and I hope that they use it. I really don't know whether it'll be useful or not. But so that's what it was for Ridley Scott. He had, he's an extremely successful director. Sometimes you're talking, by the way, to struggling screenwriters trying to break in, and they basically say, meet me for coffee at the local cafe and we'll chat. With Ridley Scott,
where I'm also a waiter.
Right. Yeah, that's very possible. So Ridley Scott obviously has a person whose job it is to make these things happen, and, gets a whole group of people together in the right place at the right time. And then that we met at his production company, obviously. And it was kind of hilarious because, the different people in Hollywood have very different levels of engagement with whether or not they need science consulting. And I think that Ridley Scott himself was sort of tickled with the idea of science consulting, but he didn't really think that he needed it. And so we chatted, and it was hilarious because it was perfectly clear that Ridley Scott would have been absolutely happy doing all the talking in our meeting, telling stories, right, about Hollywood and what he had in mind for the movie. And it was also clear that he was a very visual thinker. Like, they didn't have a screenplay yet. They had the novel, of course, so they knew the basic outlines of the story, but the screenplay hadn't been written. But he had already mapped out the visual impact of certain scenes in his mind. And, that's just, his approach is much more the striking image or, striking scene, and then let's build the narrative around that. And so his person, his assistant, I don't say assistant because that's a technical term in Hollywood. His producer or whatever would wrangle him. He's like, sort of, all right, so now that's the great story you just told, Ridley, but then we should actually get some input from the scientists.
Well, it just seems like the Forever War is so fundamentally based around the scientific idea of time dilation that you would want to get that right, or be thinking about that.
Yeah, we had 3 different consultants there. That was one of the first ones that the exchange did. And so we had me being a physicist. We also had a planetary scientist because there's a lot of different planets. And we also had an economist there because, the way that the societies organize themselves in the future is going to be very different. But yes, the idea of relativity and time dilation is crucial. And in Haldeman's book, it's sort of a metaphor for the time that passes when a soldier goes to fight in Vietnam and then comes back, right? So it seems like it's taken forever because you're different and society is different and everything. And if you travel at the speed of light to go where you're going and then come back, then it really is forever. It's a very, very long time has passed back home in a relatively short time for you.
I thought it was interesting in your conversation with Kip Thorne. It sounded like his experiences in Hollywood had not been the typical experiences, that he had been, had gotten a lot more out of it. And even in terms of just science coming out of some of the movies he had worked on.
Well, yeah. And so, he did it very intelligently and very effectively, and it can be done. But roughly speaking, the way to have a huge impact is to do it yourself. And part of what led him into this business was his friendship with Carl Sagan, whose book Contact was made into the famous movie, and Kip, played a little role in Contact, but ultimately wasn't happy with it. And so, he said, well, I'm just going to do it myself. He and his friend Linda Obst, who is a very successful Hollywood producer. And so they both became producers on the movie that eventually became Interstellar. But it started with Linda and Kip, writing a story, right? Actually coming up with the characters and the scenario and so forth. And that gives you enormously more of a handle on what will eventually happen. Still not very much, because screenwriters in the movie business do not have that much influence. It's the directors and producers who have much more influence than that. But if you're a young scientist or an old scientist, even better, who wants to have a really big impact on a Hollywood movie, the advice is write a screenplay and then get it produced. Good luck with that, by the way. It's not easy to do, but that is the way to do it.
I mean, it just sounded like, from what he was saying, that a lot of his thinking about wormholes had originated with Carl Sagan asking him, how do I teleport, the scientist character across the galaxy?
That's right. And that's absolutely, the gold standard for being a science consultant is, rather than the scientist just giving good wisdom to the screenwriter, actually being inspired to think about something in a different way. But to be fair, what inspired Kip was his conversations with Carl Sagan, not his conversations with a writer or producer in Hollywood. But yes, it was Carl Sagan wondering, because he was writing a science fiction novel, how do you get somebody across the galaxy in a short period of time? And Sagan was smart enough to know that Sagan himself was a planetary scientist. He was not a physicist. So he talked to Kip Thorne, his good friend, and said, how would you do this? And Kip started thinking about it. And because he's Kip Thorne, he's very, very smart. He realized that this opened a can of worms, including traveling backward in time. And that led to some very interesting, legitimately deep scientific research papers.
You mentioned that the two of the people that you've interviewed that are most directly related to science fiction are Annalee Newitz and Scott Derrickson, who was the director of Doctor Strange. I was just curious, did you know them, or how did they end up being guests on your podcast?
Yeah, in those cases, I both knew them ahead of time. Annalee, I have known for years, back in the IO9 days. And, we've met each other several times and been part of email lists that we're both on, et cetera. And Scott, I met actually at an event, which was sort of a Science Hollywood event. It wasn't by the exchange, and I wasn't a consultant on his movie, but he made a remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu Reeves. And so Caltech hosted an event where, before the movie came out, they talked about the science of The Day the Earth Stood Still. So Keanu was there, and Scott was there, and I was there, and another scientist from JPL on stage talking about the science scientific themes behind this movie. And we hit it off. We got along, and since then we followed each other on Twitter quite a bit. And I was a big fan of Doctor Strange and also of Sinister, his horror movie. So I thought that was a really wonderful conversation we had, because we talked about all sorts of different things.
Are there other science fiction writers or filmmakers that probably with the exchange you've interacted with a bunch, I guess, but that you're particularly close to or that you've interacted with notably?
Yeah, let me see. They're busy people, the Hollywood people. They don't have a lot of time to hang out with,
or just other novelists.
Yeah, I got to know the Big Bang Theory people pretty well. Bill Prady, one of the creators of the Big Bang Theory. The TV show that I consulted on most closely was actually Bones. I don't know if you remember that one, but procedural that teamed up a forensic anthropologist with an FBI agent, and Hart Hansen was the showrunner for that. So he and I have become friends on Twitter and go back and forth. Seth MacFarlane and I follow each other on Twitter and sometimes chat. Various people in the sort of Marvel, Disney world, people whose names you wouldn't know, like producers and assistants and things like that. Zach Stentz has become a very good friend of mine. Zach was one of the co-writers on Thor and X-Men First Class. So yeah, it's and TV is a whole nother world, right? People like Amy Berg, who's worked on Counterpart and other TV shows. Jonah Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother, who is doing Westworld these days. So yeah, I've got to know a lot of people, and it's been wonderful because, some Hollywood people have zero interest in science. Like when we went to do one of our first consults was for Thor, and the people in the room were the screenwriter at the time, who was not Zach, it was somebody else. Kenneth Branagh, who was the director of the movie, and Kevin Feige, who is the president of Marvel Studios. And it was very clear that Kenneth Branagh could not care less about the science. He was there because Kevin Feige, who is the president of Marvel Studios, thought it was really, really important to get science consulting on there. So Kevin is really into it, and he had all sorts of good questions. And Kenneth Branagh was like checking his watch and is like, basically, I've already planned out this scene. Could you give me some good buzzwords to make it sound sciencey? That's all he really wanted. So and that's fine. That, that's not his job, right? He's interested in different things. So many people in Hollywood are deeply, deeply interested in the scientific side of things, and some just really have no interest at all.
And it seems almost generational that younger people in Hollywood, it seems to me, take the science fiction more seriously and want the science to be better and just want the movies to be better overall.
Well, I think so. I think it's a combination of many things. One is that the audiences are becoming a bit more sophisticated. They don't put up with as much crap in terms of unrealistic science as they used to. But I also think that and partly the exchange, Science Entertainment Exchange, has had an impact here. I think that the barriers have been lowered a little bit for letting people in Hollywood know that it's possible to get help in science consulting, right? That's a big step. Just here's the phone number you call if you want somebody. That's an important thing to know. And so, and what we've been trying to do through the exchange is give people the idea not only that, yes, you can get input from scientists, but that it doesn't hurt your show or your movie. It makes it better if you do it well. You can actually really come up with clever ideas without sacrificing the narrative power of the story you're trying to tell.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that you're a proponent of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I heard you describe yourself as sort of a follower, I don't know if that's the right word, of Hugh Everett.
Yes.
And one thing I just read on the internet, I don't know really much about this, but I read that Hugh Everett believes that the many worlds interpretation implied personal immortality because there would always be some version of yourself surviving in some branching universe in the future. I was just curious if you knew anything about that.
Yes, it's absolutely true. I'm actually writing a book on quantum mechanics, hopefully for a broad audience, and I do talk about this fact, the so-called quantum immortality story. And there's sort of slightly different versions of it, but he did believe that. So just to back up a little bit, the idea of whatever it says is the many worlds interpretation does not come about because you take quantum mechanics and add a bunch of worlds to it. Everett realized that the worlds are already there, that in every version of quantum mechanics, there is the possibility of describing multiple worlds at once. Just like an electron can be in two different places at once, the world can be in two different configurations at once, and they don't interact with each other, so we call them separate worlds. There you go. And if you believe that, then, it's not that your choices bring about different worlds. It's that it just happens automatically. It's just the laws of physics. Now, it's not completely clear whether or not everything happens, right? And if actually, technically speaking, it's completely clear that not everything happens. The laws of physics are still obeyed. Gravity doesn't become repulsive tomorrow in some branch of the wave function of the universe. Electric charge is still conserved, etc. But within those very broad parameters, many things do happen. And you could imagine that, when some event happens in your body, like your heart fails, well, ultimately, okay, that's some chemicals in your heart that stop giving a signal, or a chemical in your brain stops sending the electrochemical signal to your heart. And there's some quantum probability that doesn't happen, right? So even though you die here in this branch of the wave function, there is some tiny fraction of a probability that in some other branch of the wave function you keep living. And there's some ever tinier branch of the wave function with less and less weight given to it, where through a series of unlikely miracles, you continue to live for an arbitrarily long time. Now, the problem there is that it's not you who's doing the living, right? Once the wave function branches, there are now two different people. It's not two different versions of you. It's two descendants of the same earlier self, but a person on one branch doesn't care or isn't related to what's happening to the person on the other branch. So if it's a 99.99% chance that I'm going to die and a 0.0001 chance that I'm going to live, there's one person who dies, and that's the overwhelming likelihood that you're going to evolve into. And there's another person.
You mean one person who lives?
One person who dies and one person who lives, right? So whichever, if it's very, very probable that you're going to die, then the way to live your life now is if you're probably going to die.
Well, wait, so you're saying that people, once the universe is branched, that's not you anymore?
Well, what I'm saying is you have to update your understanding of what it meant to have personal identity through time, okay? So ordinarily we think like there's a person who is me, and I can reliably trace that to a person I was a year ago and a person I will be a year from now. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, it's not so simple. Right? Because I'm not going to be one person a year from now. There's going to be several people, and they will all have descended from my current self. But if you ask which one of them is really me, that's not a question that has any good answer. They're all different people. There's no finger in the universe that points to one branch of the wave function and says this one is really you. They're all different people who had the same past personality. So it's not that I will continue to live on some branch of the wave function. It's that I will evolve into several people, and several of them will die, and one of them might live.
But you think that there will, at some point in the future, there will be 1,000-year-old Sean Carroll who has all of your memories, and people are just like, wow, Sean, I can't believe you're 1,000 years old. Everyone else has died when they're, well, and probably because of medical advances, this would change. But, it's so astronomically improbable that you're still alive after 1,000 years. You think that'll happen in one branch?
I think it's possible. There's details about this question which we don't know the answer to, but it's possible in exactly the same sense as if you hit your head on the wall, there's a probability that it will pass through the wall through quantum tunneling, right? It's a small probability, but if you believe the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, there'll be a branch in which it happens. That doesn't mean I recommend that you hit your head in the wall.
So do you take comfort in that, or is that just sort of an odd fact?
No, I don't want to hit my head in the wall. I don't want to die. It's not. It doesn't help that there are other branches of the wave function where I'm going to live forever if on most of the branches I'm not.
So at what point? So I guess it's weird to think about. I guess that's everything with quantum mechanics, but. So you
yeah. Well, sorry. Let's be fair. It's what is the many worlds. view is extremely simple and elegant and compelling at the level of equations, at the level of the formalism of the theory that leads you to these conclusions. But it is dramatically different from our everyday experience, right? That's the big obstacle in taking it seriously, is that we don't seem to, experience things like this in our everyday lives. So it's okay to be a little bit off-put by some of the weirder implications of many worlds. I don't think it's, it's a failure of intellect or anything like that. I think that we should be very, very skeptical of crazy scenarios like this. I think there's good reason to think that, okay, in this case, it works. But what it means is that we have to be very, very careful to remake our ideas about what it means to be a person, what it means to have an identity through time, what it means to make choices. That's just, what the universe demands of us.
So I thought it was interesting in your conversations, mostly with David Chalmers and also with Roger Penrose, they were putting forward an idea that consciousness is not just something that exists in brains, but seems to exist more fundamentally as a property of the universe or as sort of very small particles in the universe. And I was just curious what did you come out of those conversations thinking?
Yeah, no, I don't agree with either one of them. I think they're both very, very smart people in different ways. So they're worth listening to, absolutely. But for consciousness, that's exactly where I diverge from their point of view. I'm a thoroughgoing physicalist, materialist, in another philosophical term. Basically, I think that the world is made of stuff obeying the laws of physics, and consciousness or thinking or personhood or self-awareness are all things that arise out of the actions of that fundamental stuff, just obeying the laws of physics. Now, I don't have a perfectly complete final theory of how that happens. So if you want to be skeptical of that, it's okay. You're allowed. But I do think that the overwhelming evidence that the world is fundamentally physical and obeys the laws of nature is so good that we can nevertheless be pretty darn confident that that's the way consciousness will eventually be figured out.
I mean, David Chalmers talked a lot about what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is how do you explain subjective experience? And it wasn't clear to me from listening to him talk what would constitute an explanation in his mind. It seems like you could always say, no, but what really explains it?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that worry. I didn't raise that particular one because, there's only so many things I could raise. But he might answer if he were here, I don't know yet. All I know is that something has to do it, right? I think that is a weakness in his point of view, that he's asking for something and it's not clear what would ever qualify. When he talks about panpsychism, he's talking about the idea that there's a whole nother category of property that stuff can have in addition to its physical properties. Where is it? How much does it weigh? What charge does it have? How fast is it moving? It also has mental properties, a whole nother category. Like, how is it experiencing things? How does it feel? What is it thinking? And these are related to each other, but they're different. And okay, maybe you're allowed to go that far. Maybe that sounds reasonable. But then he has to say that as far as he can tell, the mental properties don't influence the physical properties in any way. Because if they did, they'd be physical properties. They would be something we should include in our laws of physics that tell us how things move. And the laws of physics seem to be working perfectly well without any of those properties. And that's the point at which I say, then what's the point? Why are we even doing this? If you're inventing a whole bunch of somewhat ill-defined new theories that stuff can have, new properties, that stuff can have, but those properties have no impact on what the stuff does, then I'm not that interested anymore.
Boy, there's a lot of things I want to talk about, but I'll try to limit it in the time we have remaining. But I guess one thing I want to mention is that I feel like reading a lot of science fiction gives people a particular worldview that people who haven't read a lot of science fiction often don't have. And I felt like I saw some of that coming through in your conversation with Carl Zimmer, where you were talking about this idea of designer babies, where people will just genetically engineer their babies to have whatever characteristics they want. And you were saying, basically, this is going to happen, which I tend to agree with. And he was, equivocating a lot more. I thought his objections were pretty well put. But do you see that? Do you agree with me that there's kind of this disjunction between the way that science fiction readers and non-science fiction readers tend to approach some of these new technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible story. I think that might be true. I mean, it seems probably right. I don't have any data one way or the other. But, it's much like being a professional philosopher in the sense that science fiction gives you training in exploring hypothetical, speculative alternatives to the world as we know it. And it might give you the wrong kind of training, for all I know, right? Like, it might lead you astray sometimes, but certainly it opens you to that possibility. And I do think that with things like designer babies, it leads you in the right direction, because I just don't see how, given the wideness of the world and the ambition of certain scientists and certain companies and certain nations, that the world can possibly avoid getting designer babies at some point or another, as long as it's technically possible. So I think that that's sort of a place where science fiction-y training helps you get the right answer. On the other hand, when I say things like, no, we're not going to build a spaceship that can go faster than the speed of light, I get a lot of pushback from people going, oh, well, scientists have always said that this is impossible or that's impossible, and they've always been wrong. And like, no, actually, this is different because it's a law of nature. It's not like we don't know how to build a rocket. It's like there are rules that we have to obey. And I think that for some people, the science fiction experience gives them a little bit too much of an openness to outlandish ideas.
I also want to, in your conversation with the poker player, Liv Boiry.
Yeah.
She was talking, I haven't read this study, but there was apparently some study that concluded that humanity is much more likely to be alone in the galaxy and maybe even the universe than had been previously appreciated. I was just curious what your impression of that study was.
Yeah, I think that it's a reasonable conclusion under the assumptions that they start with. The whole game in this question of how many other civilizations there are in the observable universe is, what assumptions do you accept? So basically, the game that these people played is, what we don't know is how likely it is that the fraction of times that an intelligent civilization arises on a planet. But they said, there's a piece of data, namely that we've looked and we haven't seen them. And given that we haven't seen them, it becomes overwhelmingly likely they're just not there. I think this is a very sensible but kind of old argument. They just sort of made it a little bit mathier and more precise. I think that for some reason I get pushback on this also, but I think we just have to be humble about this one. I think we have to say we don't know the answer to this one. Not only do we not know the answer to whether or not there is life out there, but we don't know the probability. We don't know how likely it is. It's absolutely 100% possible that the chance of life arising at all on another planet is 10 to the minus 100 per planet. And that means that it has only happened 0 times other than us in the observable universe. But it's also possible that it's 10 to the minus 3, in which case it's happened many, many millions of times. And we just don't know, and I think that's okay. We should admit that we don't know.
I mean, you'll hear people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos saying that we have to become a multiplanetary species so that, one gamma ray burst or something doesn't completely eradicate humanity on Earth. And does that argument carry more weight, do you think, if there's a, plausible possibility that there's no other intelligent life anywhere in the universe? It's just us. Do we need to put like 99% of our resources into protecting the existence of consciousness in the universe?
Yeah, I've heard arguments like that, and it doesn't sway me that much, honestly. Like, my motivation for not letting humanity become extinct was already pretty high. I didn't need an extra boost from thinking that maybe we're the only civilization out there in the universe.
Yeah, I guess so. It's sort of overdetermined in that sense.
I think so. Yeah, it's a little motivation I didn't quite need.
I also wanted to ask you about, you interviewed Tyler Cowen, who's an economist, and he was saying that our current economic system completely discounts the interests of future generations. Right. And this is something I'm kind of on about a lot. But, so I just want to draw people's attention to that. But yeah, that there's just, if you assume that there's going to be human generations for, centuries possibly millennia into the future, does that sort of dominate or should that dominate all political considerations?
I think it's a really good question, which is why I wanted to talk to Tyler about it. And I thought it was a very interesting conversation. The problem is, so I think that there's two things that I personally believe, which if you ask me to, justify them, absolutely, I would have a tough time doing, but I sort of provisionally think that's the right way to go. Number one, there's a good reason why we discount the future. We don't know it, right? It's hard to predict exactly what will happen in the future. So there's some uncertainty necessarily involved with the future. So therefore, it makes sense to discount it, because even if we have the best intentioned policies in the world, we're not sure they will lead to the consequences that we hope they do. So it just makes perfect sense to put less emphasis on the state of people in the future, because we don't know what their state is going to be. And the other is, I think, just on a perfectly moral level, I have no real objection to valuing things that are close to you more than you value things that are far away. That's true in space or in time. I think that this idea of a perfectly rational consequentialist who gives equal weight to the well-being of all beings in the universe and in time, in the past, present, and future, is not just impractical, but not even right. You can't do that. There's no way to go through life. It's just not a good moral framework to start in. If everybody tries to be nice to the people who are near to them and they interact with, and tries to be relatively nice to the people further away, then I think that's the best we can ask for, and it's a sensible way to go through life. So if we try to make life better for people who are alive today and will be alive next year, with some consideration for people who will be around 100 or 1,000 years from now, but not quite as much, I think that's a perfectly legitimate moral framework to work in.
I mean, because what I'm always saying is that I feel like, that people, that calculus is off, that people value the present over the future too much, and that one of the values of science fiction is that it makes the future seem more like a real place with real people who will have real concerns that we need to value.
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it. I think even though I, would not quite go along completely with Tyler in his suggestion that we almost give zero discounting to future generations, I still think we probably discount too much, not only in our sort of formal calculations when we're trying to play the role of economists or philosophers or whatever, but as actual policymakers and as actual citizens, I think that we devalue the future way too much. Just like as individual people, we value the chocolate chip cookie now more than the extra pound will weigh tomorrow, right? So I think as a practical matter, even though I don't think that we should have zero discounting for the future, we should probably have less than we actually do.
Yeah. All right. So unfortunately, we're all out of time. So do you have any just final thoughts, or do you have any other projects you want to mention?
Projects I want to mention? No, I already plugged my upcoming book. That's not going to be until September, on quantum mechanics, many worlds, and emergent spacetime. I think that the one thing I'll mention is that part of the philosophy of my own podcast, which comes through in the conversation we've had here, is that I don't like the barriers or walls in between different parts of intellectual inquiry. That I think that we shouldn't be quite so fetishistic about, oh, you're a physicist, you should talk about physics. You're a philosopher, you should talk about philosophy. You're a historian, you should talk about history. I think that, both within universities and research institutions and also in the wider cultural conversation, it would be really, really good to have people with different outlooks and different expertises talking to each other at a relatively high level, where they weren't just shouting at each other or, using each other to prove a point, but interrogating each other, asking questions, trying to learn more. That's definitely what I'm trying to do with my podcast. And I hope that, I think that science fiction is one of the techniques that we use for doing this. As I said to Annalee, I think there's a case to be made that science fiction writers are the world's last great generalists, because you need to know everything, including how to write a story to be a good science fiction writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have to say, I was really impressed with your podcast. I really enjoyed it. And like you're saying, I really admire just the breadth of
of intellectual ground that you cover and your familiarity with all these different subjects, I just thought was really, really intimidating, frankly. So I hope you keep doing it, and everyone go check it out. It's called Mindscape, and our guest today has been Sean Carroll. So Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Sean Carroll for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including SP Kelly, who writes, "In this age of too much content, the cream shall rise to the top. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is the best podcast covering the fields of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Mr. Kirtley fields a great variety of guests and creators to discuss every aspect of speculative fiction, from books to games to movies to television and more. I can find no better podcast that covers this subject matter in such depth. If I have any complaint, it is that they have much more time to watch movies and TV than I, and I must stockpile their discussions on those subjects until I can catch up. But the discussion is always worth the wait. I have been listening from the beginning, and I will continue to do so until there are no more episodes to follow." So big thanks again to SP Kelly for that great review. Special thanks as well to Robert Elms and Stephen Horwath, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to Juan San Miguel, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.